At 4:11 a.m. local time, one of the most sensitive pieces of infrastructure in the Gulf was no longer just an industrial asset. It had become part of the battlefield. Reports began emerging that a Kuwaiti oil refinery had been hit in a drone attack at the exact moment political rhetoric from Washington was turning darker and more explicit. The threat was no longer framed in general terms. The President of the United States was now talking openly about the possibility of striking Iran's bridges and power plants, the kinds of targets that do not just damage military capability, but disrupt the systems that hold an entire country together. And that combination, critical Gulf infrastructure under pressure while Washington threatens to hit Iran's core civilian support networks, is what makes tonight one of the most dangerous moments in this war so far. Because this is no longer only about exchange of fire. It is about the widening logic of systems warfare. Hit a refinery and you are not just damaging metal, pipes, and fuel processing units. You're sending a message to energy markets, insurers, governments, and every military planner responsible for protecting the Gulf. Threaten bridges and power plants, and you're not just talking about punishing a state. You're talking about pressure on movement, electricity, logistics, industry, communications, and civilian life. In other words, the war is moving beyond military targets toward the systems that make military and economic order possible. That is always a dangerous transition, because once a war starts targeting the systems behind daily life, water, power, transport, fuel, and the industrial nodes that connect them, the meaning of escalation changes. The conflict stops being measured only in destroyed launchers or bombed warehouses. It starts being measured in whether governments can still guarantee normal life, whether infrastructure can still operate under threat, and whether the region's economic machine can keep running while missiles, drones, and threats are closing in around it. Let me explain why the Kuwait angle matters so much. Because some people will hear refinery hit and assume this is simply one more event in a wider conflict. It is not. A strike on a Gulf refinery is not just an attack on an energy site. It is an attack on confidence. The Gulf runs on confidence. Confidence that oil can flow. Confidence that refineries can process. Confidence that tankers can move. Confidence that airports will function. Desalination systems will hold. And the industrial backbone of the region can withstand the pressure of war happening around it. Once that confidence begins to crack, the strategic consequences spread much faster than the physical damage itself. That is why even a limited strike on refinery infrastructure can have a much larger effect than its immediate blast radius would suggest. Markets react. Governments raise alerts. Security forces shift posture. Insurance costs rise. Military planners begin asking whether the next target will be another refinery, a port, a power station, a water plant, or a transport node. And that is exactly the point of systems pressure. You do not need to physically shut down everything. You only need to make everything feel vulnerable. Now place that next to Washington's rhetoric. A threat to strike Iran's bridges and power plants is not a standard military warning. It is a message that the United States may be willing to move from targeting combat capability to targeting the infrastructure that supports national resilience. Bridges connect movement, logistics, military resupply, and civilian life. Power plants sustain communications, industry, command systems, hospitals, transport, and daily existence. Threatening those targets communicates something very specific. If this war expands further, the costs imposed on Iran may no longer remain confined to military hardware. They may begin to affect the physical framework of the state. That is a major escalation in signaling even before any such strike happens, because once those categories of targets are openly discussed, the psychological boundary shifts. Tehran hears that warning not simply as a military threat, but as a threat against state endurance. Gulf states hear it and immediately understand that the war is moving closer to the kind of infrastructure conflict that can destabilize the whole region. Markets hear it and conclude that the path from military exchange to economic shock is getting shorter. And NATO hears something else entirely. Reports that Trump's anger over Iran is pushing NATO into fresh crisis tell us that this conflict is now creating strain not only on the battlefield, but inside the Western alliance itself. That matters because alliance cohesion is one of the key pillars of long-duration deterrence. If some allies fear being dragged into a wider war without a clear strategy, while others focus on immediate military signaling, the coalition begins to show stress. Stress does not always appear as open division. Sometimes it appears as hesitation, mixed messaging, or uncertainty over what kind of escalation can still be supported. That is where this story becomes bigger than Kuwait, bigger than one refinery, and bigger than one threat from Washington. It becomes a story about whether the war is now beginning to stress the entire support architecture around it. Gulf infrastructure, Western political unity, energy stability, and regional force protection all at the same time. Defense. Math. Now, here's the defense math, because this is what explains why hitting a refinery or threatening power plants matters even before the biggest attacks occur. The side defending infrastructure has to protect everything all the time. The The side attacking it only has to find one opening at the right moment. That asymmetry is brutal. A Gulf state must monitor its airspace continuously, maintain radar coverage, harden energy infrastructure, secure transport nodes, prepare emergency services, reassure markets, and coordinate with military partners. It has to do this day after day under public scrutiny and economic pressure. Meanwhile, the attacking side can choose the time, the angle, the type of drone or missile, and the target category that creates the most political shock per dollar spent. A refinery is a perfect example of that asymmetry. It is fixed. It is valuable. It matters economically. It matters psychologically. It matters regionally. It cannot simply be moved. Defending it requires layers of sensors, interceptors, guards, emergency response, and resilience planning. Attacking it may require only one successful penetration or one convincing attempt. Even if the physical damage is limited, the strategic damage begins the moment the world sees that such a site can be reached. The same logic applies to water plants, ports, airports, bridges, and power systems. These are not just targets. They are leverage points. Hit them, threaten them, or even make them look reachable, and the burden on the defender rises immediately. More guards, more alert hours, more money, more fear, more political pressure. That is systems warfare in its most efficient form. And that is why the Gulf is so exposed in this phase of the conflict. It contains a dense concentration of strategic infrastructure that is both regionally essential and geographically accessible to pressure. Oil and water systems in particular are not just local assets. They are survival assets. Hit an oil refinery and you shake markets. Hit a water plant and you trigger public anxiety in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The symbolism is powerful because the targets themselves represent continuity, life, and state competence. Now let's turn back to Washington's threat. Because a threat to hit bridges and power plants tells us something about how American pressure may be evolving. It suggests a willingness to hold at risk the infrastructure of state function, not just the hardware of military operations. That kind of threat is designed to do several things at once. First, to tell Tehran that if Gulf infrastructure is not off limits, then Iranian infrastructure will not be off limits either. Second, to signal to domestic audiences that stronger tools remain available. Third, to try to restore deterrence by making the cost of further escalation look unacceptably high. But deterrence threats can create a trap. If Iran believes that broader pressure is already the only way to preserve its own deterrence, then harder American threats may not produce restraint. They may produce preemption, retaliation, or a wider search for targets that impose cost without crossing directly into full conventional war. That is how conflicts spread into indirect domains, through drones, maritime incidents, cyber attacks, infrastructure sabotage, and partner-based pressure. The more explicitly one side threatens systemic punishment, the more the other side may feel it must prove it can still disrupt systems too. This is why the reported attacks in Kuwait matter beyond Kuwait itself. They tell us the war is moving into a phase where the supporting architecture around the battlefield is becoming the battlefield. And when that happens, the map of danger expands very quickly. Suddenly, military planners are not only watching missile bases and airfields, they are watching refineries, pumping stations, desalination facilities, bridges, substations, ports, storage farms, and transmission lines. Civilian infrastructure becomes strategically relevant because it shapes how long a state can function under pressure. That is also why this story intersects with the Strait of Hormuz and broader defense planning. Defense news, pointing to air denial, missiles, ships, and projects like a Golden Dome, tells us something important. Washington is thinking in terms of layered defense against a threat environment that is no longer theoretical. Air denial is not only about stopping enemy aircraft, it is about denying the enemy freedom to threaten the wider system, the sea lanes, the oil routes, the infrastructure nodes, and the military assets that keep the region connected. The more this war centers on infrastructure and corridors, the more defense itself becomes a race to protect the system before the next weak point is found. Now consider the political psychology of all this. In the United States, a threat to strike Iran's bridges and power plants may sound like an attempt to project resolve. In Tehran, it can sound like proof that Washington is preparing to attack the foundations of national endurance. In the Gulf, it sounds like confirmation that the conflict is moving closer to the type of infrastructure war regional governments fear most. In NATO capitals, it sounds like the kind of escalation that could widen commitments, strain alliances, and force uncomfortable decisions about support, posture, and limits. That is why the alliance angle matters. NATO is not just a military machine, it is a political coalition built on shared risk calculations. When a conflict with Iran begins creating crisis language inside that coalition, it means the war is no longer only testing regional security, it is testing Western cohesion. Some members may prioritize deterrence through strength. Others may fear mission creep, energy instability, and being dragged toward a wider confrontation without a clearly defined end state. Those tensions may not break the alliance, but they can complicate the unity required for sustained pressure. And unity matters, because the side under pressure watches for cracks. If Tehran sees that attacks on Gulf infrastructure, rising energy anxiety, and harsher U.S. rhetoric are all creating stress inside the opposing coalition, that itself becomes strategic information. It suggests that the war can still be shaped through pressure, not necessarily by winning militarily in the conventional sense, but by making the coalition pay in enough different ways that political cohesion becomes harder to maintain. What happens next? So what happens next? First, watch whether infrastructure targeting becomes a pattern rather than an isolated shock. One refinery hit is serious. A sequence involving refineries, water plants, ports, airports, or transmission nodes would mean the war has clearly entered a systems pressure phase. Second, watch whether Washington's rhetoric about bridges and power plants remains a deterrent warning or evolves into operational signaling. The difference matters. A threat can be part of escalation control. Visible preparation to carry it out would be something else entirely. Third, watch Gulf force protection. If energy sites, desalination facilities, airports, and industrial zones move to visibly higher alert, that will tell you regional governments expect the infrastructure map itself to stay under threat. Fourth, watch oil prices and shipping behavior. A refinery strike matters because it connects the local battlefield to the global economy almost instantly. If markets continue to react sharply, that is a sign confidence is weakening faster than public reassurance can repair it. Fifth, watch NATO messaging. If alliance statements begin sounding more cautious, more divided, or more defensive, that will indicate the political pressure from this war is starting to affect the cohesion behind it. Here's the bottom line. A reported drone strike on a Kuwait oil refinery at the same time Washington openly threatens Iran's bridges and power plants tells us that this conflict is moving into a more dangerous category. It is no longer only about military attrition. It is about attacking or threatening the systems that make states function and regions stable. Oil processing, water supply, transport links, power generation, alliance unity, and public confidence are all becoming part of the same battle space. In one line, the war is moving from firepower to infrastructure, and that is when regional crises become much harder to contain. That is why tonight matters, because the logic of the conflict is changing. When refineries are hit, water systems are threatened, and power plants and bridges are named in presidential warnings, the line between battlefield targets and national life support systems begins to blur. Once that line blurs, the costs rise faster, the map expands wider, and the margin for miscalculation shrinks dramatically. The refinery matters, the threat matters, the alliance stress matters, and together they tell a larger story. The region is entering a phase where the next strikes may not be judged only by what they destroy, but by how much of the system they make feel unsafe.